Mr. Thomas placed a small paper bag on the cold basement floor, then quietly shut the heavy boiler room door. He never asked the soldier's name, just left a warm meal each morning before anyone else arrived. 15 years later, during graduation, a man in a tailored suit walked onto the stage, holding the deed to the entire school. Who was he? And why did the entire auditorium rise when he pointed at the janitor? Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Thomas Marlowe was 63 years old, a fixture at Willow Creek High School, where he had worked as a janitor for nearly 3 decades. His stooped shoulders and weathered hands told the story of a man who had spent his life in physical labor. Yet his eyes remained kind behind wire-rimmed glasses that had gone out of style long ago. The students called him Mr. Thomas, the few who bothered to address him at all, and most teachers regarded him with the polite indifference reserved for those who exist on the periphery of important work. The school's hallways were more home to him than his small apartment 3 blocks away. After his wife Margaret passed from cancer 12 years earlier, and his only daughter moved across the country for work, Thomas found comfort in the predictable rhythms of maintaining the aging school building. He knew every creaking floorboard, every temperamental radiator, every classroom where windows stuck in humid weather. He could predict which bathroom would flood during heavy rain, which lockers would jam in winter, and exactly how many minutes it would take to mop the cafeteria after a food fight. Principal Hargrove often remarked that Thomas knew more about the building's history than anyone else. "This place would fall apart without you, Thomas," she would say, not realizing how literally true that statement was. Behind the scenes, Thomas performed minor miracles with duct tape, WD-40, and the accumulated wisdom of decades repairing things others would simply replace. His routine rarely varied. Arrive at 5:30 a.m., check the boilers and heating system, clean the main hallways before students arrived, then tackle whatever calamity awaited him that day. He took lunch at 11:30, always alone in the small maintenance office, eating the same sandwich and apple he had packed for years. Evenings meant emptying trash cans, sweeping classrooms, and preparing the building for the next day before locking up at 6 p.m. On a particularly bitter December evening, a sleet tapped against the windows. Thomas was emptying trash bins behind the cafeteria when he noticed a figure huddled against the brick wall. The man wore a tattered camouflage jacket several sizes too large, his few possessions stuffed into a worn backpack beside him. Despite the cold, he sat with military straightness, dignity, and tact, even in obvious desperation. When Thomas approached, the man didn't beg or make excuses. He simply looked up, his eyes clear despite his circumstances. "Sorry to trespass," he said in a voice that suggested education beneath its wariness. "I just needed somewhere out of the wind tonight." Something in his bearing, perhaps the way he automatically squared his shoulders when he spoke, told Thomas this was no ordinary homeless person. There was a disciplined precision to his movements that spoke of military training, a ghost of who he had once been. "You sir?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. The man nodded once. "Marines. 2 tours." Thomas hesitated only briefly before making a decision that contradicted every school policy. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Stay quiet and follow exactly where I walk." He led the stranger through the service entrance, down a narrow corridor lined with cleaning supplies, and finally to a heavy door marked maintenance only. Behind it lay the boiler room, the heart of the ancient heating system that kept Clay Ridge functional through harsh winter. It was always warm, secluded from the main building, and rarely visited by anyone but Thomas himself. "There's an old cot in the corner," Thomas explained, pointing to a folding bed left over from a time when janitors sometimes stayed overnight during blizzards. "Bathrooms through there. You'll need to be gone by 5:30 a.m. when the morning crew arrives." The veteran stood in the doorway, momentarily overwhelmed. Why would you risk your job for a stranger? Thomas thought about his father, who had never quite recovered from his time in Korea. "My dad was 82nd Airborne," he said simply. "Taught me you don't leave a man behind." The arrangement was supposed to be for one night, just enough to let the man escape the worst of the winter storm. But when Thomas arrived early the next morning, he found the boiler room spotless, the cot neatly made with hospital corners. On a piece of scrap paper lay a note: "Thank you. Fix the leaking valve on the east pipe." Thomas found himself leaving the door unlocked that night, and soon it became an unspoken arrangement. The veteran would slip in after dark and be gone before dawn, leaving no trace except for occasional repairs, far better than Thomas could have managed with his arthritic hands. 2 months into the silent partnership, Principal Hargrove called Thomas into her office, her expression grave. "Thomas, is there something you want to tell me about the building's security at night?" Thomas stood straight despite the pain in his lower back. "No, ma'am, nothing to report. Some of the teachers have noticed signs of presence in the building after hours." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes we have to do what's right, even when it doesn't fit the rules." If you believe a good person deserves to be remembered, please stay with us. After that first night, the veteran continued returning to the boiler room. Thomas never knew where he went during daylight hours, perhaps to the VA hospital 20 miles away or looking for work in town. But most evenings around 9 o'clock, there would be a soft pattern of knocks on the maintenance door after the school had emptied of students and most staff had gone home for the day. Thomas prepared for these visits, with increasing thoughtfulness. A spare blanket appeared on the cot, then a small pillow, a carefully arranged box of non-perishable food items, protein bars, canned goods with pop-tops, dried fruit, sometimes clean socks or toiletries purchased from the dollar store on his meager salary. Once he left a paperback novel he'd found in the school's lost and found box, unclaimed for months. He never asked questions, respecting the man's privacy and dignity, understanding that sometimes silence is the kindest gift you can offer someone. Rebuilding themselves. As January turned to February, Thomas began to notice small improvements around the building, things he hadn't done himself. A sticky door that no longer stuck, a loose handrail secured, the ancient coffee maker in the teacher's lounge, perpetually problematic, suddenly working flawless. One evening in late February, Thomas entered the boiler room to find the veteran kneeling beside one of the heating pipes, carefully applying a wrench to a connection point. The man worked with the focus of someone who understood mechanical systems intimately, his movements economical and pressure valve was showing signs of strain, he explained without looking up, could have caused problems next week. When the temperature drops again, the threading was starting to wear. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, watching the practice movements. You've done this kind of work before. The veteran smiled faintly, the expression transforming his haggard face into something younger. I did a lot more than this. Engineering degree from Purdue University before I enlisted, specialized in structural systems in the Corps. He tightened the valve with precision. Not that it matters much now. Why doesn't it matter? Thomas asked. The man's hand stilled momentarily. Hard to get security clearance when you're living on the streets. Hard to get an address without a job. Hard to get a job without an address. He resumed working. It's a circle not many make it out of. Thomas nodded, understanding the trap many veterans found themselves in. What's your name? He finally asked after months of deliberate anonymity. A pause. Daniel. That night after Daniel had fallen asleep, Thomas noticed the man's backpack partially open. Inside was a wooden box, meticulously maintained, despite the owner's circumstances. Thomas didn't mean to pry, but as he set down a fresh sandwich for the morning, he glimpsed the content. A faded military ID card, a purple heart medal nestled in its case, and a photograph showing a group of Marines in desert fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders. The next evening, Daniel addressed the unspoken question. Lost my team in Ramadi. Came home with medals I didn't want and memories I couldn't shake. His voice was flat, factual. Wife couldn't handle who I'd become. Parents passed while I was deployed. House foreclosed during my third tour. I'm sorry, Thomas said, knowing the inadequacy of the words. Daniel shook his head. I'm not telling you for pity, just so you know why. He gestured to his current state. But I made a promise to my sergeant before he died. Said I'd make something meaningful when I got back. Still working on that. Thomas simply nodded, understanding that sometimes presence meant more than work. Their arrangement continued through winter into spring. Daniel began doing more repairs around the school, fixing locked windows in empty classrooms, unclogging drains in rarely used bathrooms. Small improvements that went unnoticed by most, but made Thomas's work easier. They were careful to leave no evidence, but as with all secrets in small institutions, whispers began. One afternoon in April, a geometry teacher reported footprints in dust in a storage area near the basement. The school resource officer conducted a cursory investigation, finding nothing but noting unauthorized access concerns in his report. The administration heightened their vigilance. Thomas was called to Principal Hargrove's office for the second time. The atmosphere was less forgiving now. Miss Grady, she began formally, we have reason to believe you've been allowing someone to shelter in the school building after hours. This is a serious breach of security protocols and potentially endangers our students. No student has ever been at risk, Thomas responded quietly. So you admit? Her eyebrows rose. I admit to having compassion for a veteran who served his country and needed temporary shelter. The vice principal, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. We could terminate your employment for this, Thomas. Decades of service or not. Thomas looked at them both. These administrators who worked in heated offices, while he unclogged toilets and mopped floors, contaminated with teenage stomach flu. If I lose my job because I refuse to turn away someone who fought for his country, then I'll accept that consequence. The meeting ended with a final warning, rather than termination, partly because of Thomas's long service record, and partly because they lacked definitive proof. But security measures were increased, including new locks on the maintenance area. That night, Thomas had to tell Daniel they needed to suspend their arrangement. Daniel accepted the news with the same quiet dignity he showed in all things. "You've done more than enough," he said, extending his hand to Thomas, "more than anyone has in years." Before he left that final night, Daniel handed Thomas a small folded paper. "If you ever hear my name someday, know that I never forgot." Thomas kept that paper in his locker for 15 years, through 3 principals and countless students. Its contents remain private, a reminder of a promise he couldn't fully understand, but somehow trusted would be kept. What do you think about someone who sacrificed for their country, having nowhere to sleep? Type respect if you believe they deserve to be remembered. 15 years past. Willow Creek High School weathered changes in administration, curriculum reforms, and budget cuts that left the once proud institution struggling to maintain basic standards. The current principal, a harried woman named Carla Avery, presided over declining enrollment and deteriorating facilities with diminishing resources. Thomas, now 78, moved more slowly but remained as dedicated as ever. Some teachers suggested he retire, but everyone knew the truth. The school needed him more than he needed the meager salary. Younger maintenance workers came and went, unable to master the building's ancient systems, the way Thomas had. The announcement came in early March. The district planned to close Clay Ridge at the end of the academic year. The building would be sold to developers, eyeing the prime location for luxury condominiums. Teachers would be reassigned, students redistributed to already crowded schools across the district. A community meeting was scheduled to address concerns and explain the transition process. The gymnasium filled with anxious parents, nostalgic alumni, and staff members facing uncertain futures. Principal Avery struggled to maintain order, as emotional outbursts interrupted her prepared statement. "We understand your disappointment," she was saying, "but the financial realities." Her words were cut short by the sound of vehicle doors closing outside. Through the gymnasium windows, attendees could see 4 black SUVs pulling into the circular driveway, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. The double doors at the back of the gymnasium opened. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit entered, followed by several associates carrying leather portfolios. His presence commanded attention, not through volume or dramatic gesture, but through the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. He strode purposefully to the front of the room, nodding respectfully to Principal Avery before addressing the crowd. "Please forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "My name is Daniel Hugh J. Trent, CEO of Trent Defense System. I'm here because I have information relevant to your discussion." Thomas, who had been standing unobtrusively against the back wall, as was his custom, dropped the pen he'd been holding. The clatter drew several glances, including one from Trent himself, whose composed expression softened momentarily. Trent opened a slim leather portfolio. "I've just come from the district offices, where I've presented an alternative proposal regarding Willow Creek High School." He withdrew several documents. "Rather than selling this property for residential development, I've purchased it for the purpose of maintaining and expanding its educational mission." Murmurs spread through the gymnasium. Principal Avery stepped forward. "Mr. Trent, I don't understand. The school board didn't mention any competing offers." "That's because the final arrangements were completed this morning," Trent replied, handing her the top document. "My company has established an educational foundation that will operate Clay Ridge as a public charter school, with specialized STEM programming and full scholarships for veterans' children." The room erupted in confused excitement. Parents exchanged bewildered but hopeful glances. Teachers whispered urgently to one another. Through it all, Trent maintained his composed demeanor, waiting for the noise to subside. "Some of you may wonder why a defense contractor would invest in a struggling high school," he continued, once he could be heard. "The answer is simple, but personal." His gaze swept the room, eventually settling on the back wall. "Thomas Grady, would you join me please?" All heads turned toward Thomas, who stood frozen in disbelief. After a moment's hesitation, he made his way forward, his worn work boots squeaking slightly against the polished floor. When Thomas reached the front, Trent extended his hand. "Do you remember me, Mr. Grady?" Thomas nodded slowly, decades falling away as he recognized the eyes of the homeless veteran in this successful executive's face. "Yes, sir, I do." Trent turned back to the astonished crowd. 15 years ago, I was at my lowest point. After 3 tours with the Marines, I came home with invisible wounds and visible homelessness. When most people crossed the street to avoid me,
This man, he gestured to Thomas, gave me shelter in the boiler room of this very building. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. For months he provided not just a warm place to sleep, but something far more valuable, dignity. He treated me like a human being when most of society had decided I was disposable. Thomas stood uncomfortably under the attention, his eyes lowered. Trent continued, his voice taking on emotional weight despite his composed exterior. What Mr. Grady never knew was that during those months, I was using the school's library computer after hours to develop the targeting algorithm that eventually became the foundation of my company. The night I left his care, I promised myself that if I ever succeeded, I would find a way to repay his kindness. Teachers who had worked alongside Thomas for years stared in amazement. Parents who had barely noticed the elderly janitor saw him with new eyes. No one remembered my name then, Trent said, his gaze returning to Thomas. But I remembered yours, the first person who treated me like a man, instead of a problem. The renovation plans Trent outlined were comprehensive: state-of-the-art science laboratories, a technology center, upgraded athletic facilities, and enhanced security systems. Teacher salaries would increase to attract top talent. The building's historical architecture would be preserved, while modernizing its infrastructure. There is one non-negotiable condition to this arrangement, Trent added, as he concluded. Thomas Grady must be offered a lifetime position as Facilities Director Emeritus, with full benefits and a salary commensurate with his invaluable knowledge of this building. Principal Avery, still processing this extraordinary turn of events, managed to ask, and if he wishes to retire, Trent smiled, then he'll receive the pension he deserves for 30 years of service, not the inadequate one currently budgeted. As the meeting adjourned in a buzz of excitement and renewed hope, Trent approached Thomas privately. I hope I didn't embarrass you, he said, but some debts can't remain unpaid. Thomas found his voice at last. You didn't owe me anything, Mr. Daniel Hugh, the younger man corrected. And yes, I did. You saw me when I was invisible. That's worth more than this building could ever cost. Type justice, if you believe that right actions, even quietly done, eventually receive their due. The transformation of Willow Creek High School began that summer. Construction crews worked around the clock to modernize classrooms, replace outdated systems, and enhance athletic facilities. The building's historic facade remained, but inside, 21st-century technology replaced equipment that had been obsolete for decades. What had been a dying institution preparing for closure now hummed with renewed purpose and activity. The changes extended beyond mere infrastructure. Daniel Trent's foundation recruited top teaching talent with salaries 30% above district standards. The curriculum expanded to include specialized engineering tracks, computer science programs, and entrepreneurship initiatives. Each classroom received state-of-the-art technology, and the old library transformed into a digital learning commons, with resources rivaling many colleges. Perhaps most significant was the newly established Veterans Children's Scholarship Fund, guaranteeing full college tuition for children of military families, and creating mentorship programs, connecting students with successful veterans in various professional fields. Within months, enrollment applications surged as families sought to transfer into the district. Most meaningful to Thomas was the renovation of the main hallway, now named Hall of Quiet Heroes. Its walls featured photographs and stories of local veterans and first responders whose everyday courage had shaped the community. Students would walk this corridor daily, reminded that greatness often wore ordinary faces, and carried out its most important work without fanfare or recognition. The boiler room received special attention. Though the ancient heating system was replaced with modern equipment, the space itself was preserved and transformed into a small museum. A simple bronze plaque beside the door read, "In honor of one night of shelter that changed 2 lives." Thomas continued his daily rounds, now with an assistant and proper equipment. Students who had previously hurried past him without a glance now greeted him by name, some even stopping to ask questions about the building's history. Teachers who had taken his presence for granted now invited him to speak to their classes about the school's evolution over 3 decades. At the grand reopening ceremony, Daniel Trent returned as the keynote speaker. Hundreds gathered in the new auditorium. Students, parents, community members, and media representatives drawn by the unusual story of a homeless veteran turned defense contractor saving a local school. People often ask what makes a successful life, Trent began, standing at the podium in his Marine dress uniform, rather than a business suit. We're taught to measure success in dollars earned, promotions received, or possessions acquired. But those metrics miss something essential about human existence. He gestured toward Thomas, seated in the front row. This man never earned a six-figure salary. He never ran a corporation, or invented a revolutionary technology. By conventional standards, his career might seem modest. Yet the impact of his compassion has rippled outward in ways none of us can fully measure. Trent paused, his composed demeanor momentarily softening. There was a time when I believed I had no value left. That my education, my skills, and my potential had all been buried in the trauma of war. I had become, in the eyes of most, just another broken veteran to step around on the sidewalk. The auditorium was silent, hundreds of people collectively holding their breath. But then, a tired janitor with problems of his own decided I was worth seeing, worth helping, worth treating with dignity. Trent's voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected deeper emotion, and that simple recognition, that basic human acknowledgement, changed everything. After the ceremony, Trent found Thomas inspecting the new science wing, checking that every detail met his exacting standard. Still working overtime? Trent asked with a smile. Thomas shrugged, hard to break old habits. Trent reached into his pocket and withdrew a weathered piece of paper, the same note he had given Thomas 15 years earlier. You kept it all this time. Never knew what it meant, Thomas admitted, but it seemed important. Trent carefully unfolded it, revealing a complex algorithm written in faded ink. This was the beginning of everything I built. I wrote it the night before I left, sitting by that old boiler. It's been the foundation of systems, now used by defense agencies worldwide. He pressed the paper back into Thomas's hands. It belongs with you. You were the catalyst for what it became. As graduation season approached, Thomas noticed something unexpected. College acceptance letters for every senior, regardless of family income. When he quietly inquired, the guidance counselor smiled. Anonymous donor established a full scholarship fund. Every Clay Ridge graduate gets a chance at higher education now. Thomas didn't need to ask who the donor was. Some acts of kindness echo forward, multiplying their impact through time. That spring evening, Thomas stood outside the gymnasium, now vibrant with banners and student laughter. He looked toward the old boiler room window, half expecting to see a shadow cross it. What he had done years ago wasn't heroic, it was human. But Daniel had transformed that moment into a movement, and somewhere deep down, Thomas felt peace, proof that the quietest acts plant the loudest legacies. Have you ever helped someone without remembering their name? Sometimes a small action changes their entire life. Share a moment of kindness you've witnessed, because here, right actions are always remembered. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where quiet actions become legacies of kindness.